From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We're coming out and saying we're going to let people know their rights, we're going to do what we can to protect our neighbors, and we're going to continue to do it for as long as we need to.
While immigration widespread raids did not materialize this weekend after President Trump announced them in advance, that announcement still terrorized immigrant communities around the country. We'll speak with Columbia University law professor Ilora Mukherjee, who interviewed dozens of detained children and represents the youngest child separated from his family at the border. He was just 4 months old. We'll also go to Colorado to speak with Rosa Sabido, an undocumented immigrant who's taken sanctuary in a church.
My name is Rosa Sabido, and I'm here in Sanctuary in the Mancos United Methodist Church. I only had two choices if I want to remain in the country. It was either take sanctuary or be willing to be taken in custody and be detained in an immigration detention center, which is practically to be in jail.
Then Tropical Storm Barry makes landfall in Louisiana, putting millions at risk of epic flooding. President Trump declared a state of emergency and more than 60,000 were without power.
We're in hurricane season. We don't know when the next time is going to be that we get a storm. We assume it can be very quickly. So we're going to be out and about, and that's why this really isn't over.
But the biggest climate news is in South Asia, where monsoon season has pummelled with deadly rains. We'll speak with environmental reporter Dar Jamal about the impact of climate change on extreme weather. And his new report, over 1/10 of the global south could lack drinking water by 2030. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Widespread raids by immigration agents did not materialize over the weekend, despite threats by President Trump. A handful of raids did still unfold across the country, and protesters rallied in support of immigrant communities. Agents in Chicago reportedly arrested a mother and her children, only to quickly release them. Arrests were also attempted here in New York City, but migrants reportedly refused to open their doors to agents. On Sunday in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, one of the neighborhoods targeted by ICE early Saturday morning, there was a vigil to continue informing the community of their rights. This is Fabiola Mendieta, an organizer with the New Sanctuary Coalition.
We're here today because we heard what happened yesterday, that ICE came to our neighborhood. And we tried to stay together and say that, tell them a message saying that they're not welcome here.
And this is New York State Senator Jessica Ramos at another rally in Jackson Heights, Queens.
We are the most diverse district in the entire country, and with that comes a huge responsibility for every single section of our neighbors. So for our undocumented neighbors, we're out here trying to show solidarity, making sure that people understand their rights. Here in Jackson Heights, we always band together to protect each other, and no one, not even the President of the United States, is going to mess with our neighbors.
Authorities say more raids are planned this week. We'll have more on the story after headlines. Vice President Mike Pence defended conditions for detained migrants after visiting 2 detention facilities in Texas Friday.
Every family that I spoke to told me that they were being well cared for, and different than some of the harsh rhetoric that we hear from Democrats on Capitol Hill. Our Customs and Border Protection are doing their level best to provide compassionate care to these families in a manner the American people would expect.
A tweet from Washington Post reporter Josh Dawsey, who was covering the vice president's visit, leading a delegation, described the dire conditions inside one of the jails. VP saw 384 men sleeping inside fences on concrete with no pillows or mats. They said they hadn't showered in weeks, wanted toothbrushes, food. Stench was overwhelming. CBP said they were fed regularly, could brush daily, and recently got access to shower. Many hadn't for 10 to 20 days, Josh Dawsey tweeted. Meanwhile, a new report from the House Oversight Committee released Friday found at least 18 migrant children under the age of 2 have been separated from their families at the border as part of Trump's zero-tolerance family separation policy. This included 9 infants under the age of 1. On Sunday, President Trump unleashed a racist attack on 4 progressive congresswomen of color, telling them to, quote, go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came, unquote. The tweets were aimed at Congressmembers Ayanna Pressley, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar. All 4 are U.S. citizens. 3 of them were born in the United States. Ilhan Omar was born in Somalia before coming to the U.S. as a refugee at the age of 12. Congressmember Omar fired back at Trump, tweeting, as members of Congress, the only country we swear an oath to is the United States, which is why we're fighting to protect it from the worst, most corrupt and inept president we have ever seen. Congressmember Omar added, you are stoking white nationalism because you are angry that people like us are serving in Congress and fighting against your hate-filled agenda, she said. Trump's Twitter tirade also named House Speaker Pelosi. He wrote, these places need your help badly. You can't leave fast enough. I'm sure that Nancy Pelosi would be very happy to quickly work out free travel arrangements. House Speaker Pelosi called Trump's remark xenophobic and said Trump's tweet reaffirms his plan to make America great again has always been about making America white again. Our diversity is our strength and our unity is our power, she said. Trump's racist attacks come on the heels of a public feud between Speaker Pelosi and the 4 Congress members following last month's passage of the contested border funding bill opposed by all 4. Last week, House Speaker Pelosi told the New York Times all these people have their public whatever and their Twitter world, but they didn't have any following. They're 4 people, and that's how many votes they got. AOC tweeted in response that public whatever is called public sentiment, and wielding the power to shift it is how we actually achieve meaningful change in this country. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez also said in an interview that Pelosi's, quote, explicit singling out of newly elected women of color was outright disrespectful. Last week, Pelosi told the progressive Congress members to bring any grievances to her in person rather than express them via Twitter. A White House meeting today between Guatemalan President Jimmy Morales and President Trump has been canceled as reports emerged of a safe third country agreement that was to be signed between the 2 heads of state. The reported deal would allow the U.S. to send migrants from any country of origin to Guatemala instead of processing asylum requests at the U.S. border. Safe third country agreements typically mean migrants have to apply for asylum at the first safe country reached instead of the destination. According, Guatemala temporarily blocked the signing of any such agreement late Sunday following widespread outcry and a request by 5 former Guatemalan officials to prevent the deal from being enacted. Alex Acosta is out as labor secretary amidst the fallout from the Jeffrey Epstein case. Trump announced the departure on Friday, saying the decision was Acosta's. He stood at his side when Acosta explained why he was resigning. 2 days earlier, Acosta continued to defend himself for his plea deal with accused serial sexual predator Jeffrey Epstein in 2008 when he was a U.S. prosecutor, a U.S. attorney in Florida. Epstein, who's now standing trial in New York on similar charges, received just 13 months in county jail, despite being accused of sexually abusing and trafficking hundreds of underage girls. Trump has tapped Patrick Pizzella as acting labor secretary. Pizzella, the current deputy labor secretary, is known for opposing labor rights. In the 1990s, he worked with disgraced Republican lobbyist, now ex-convict Jack Abramoff, to deny worker protections in the Northern Mariana Islands. In South Asia, ongoing heavy rain and flooding have killed at least 67 people in Nepal, 25 in India, and 14 in Bangladesh. Monsoon rains have affected more than 1 million people in South Asia, including thousands of Rohingya Muslim refugees in southern Bangladesh's Cox's Bazar, the largest refugee camp in the world. The Tunisian Red Crescent says the bodies of all 82 missing people who were on board a migrant ship that sank off its coast earlier this month have been recovered. The boat was heading to Europe from Libya. Tunisian fishermen initially rescued 4 of the boat's passengers, but 1 later died in hospital. According to the International Organization for Migration, at least 426 people have drowned attempting to cross the Mediterranean so far this year, while thousands have been returned to migrant jails in Libya. In Algeria, protesters took to the streets Friday for the 21st straight week to call for the establishment of independent civilian-led institutions to oversee upcoming elections.
The regime has to fall and we will build another Algeria, free and independent, an independent justice, an independent regime, and an independent president. To build a country with an independent economy. We rule our country. We are
and she needs to hear all the sides. Longtime President Abdelaziz Bouteflika resigned in April amidst the popular uprising. Elections planned for July 4th were canceled after protesters said they would be controlled by the army and politicians from the ruling elite. The interim president, Abdelkader Ben Salah, who's backed by the military, remains in power despite his mandate having expired last week. In Ecuador, members of the indigenous Guarani tribe celebrated as a court upheld a ruling barring the government from selling land in the Amazon to oil companies. The Guarani argued they had not been consulted over the government's plans to auction off their ancestral lands. The historic ruling could set a precedent for other indigenous groups fighting exploitation of their lands. This is Guarani activist Namante Nankimo.
And this victory means that our Guarani people and the future generations, the children, our children, will live healthy and without contamination. And that also means to the world that we contribute to the air that you breathe, which is from the Amazon.
The Israeli army said it accidentally killed 28-year-old Hamas member Mahmoud al-Adam in the occupied Gaza Strip Thursday. Al-Adam was attempting to turn away 2 young Palestinians near the Gaza Strip separation barrier with Israel when the soldiers shot him. The killing came amidst a fragile truce that was mediated by Egypt, Qatar, and the UN, following a spike in violence in May that killed at least 25 Palestinians. In Somalia, gunmen killed a reported 26 people after they stormed and took siege in a hotel in the southern port city of Kismayo. The dead include Kenyans, Americans, and a Britanist, Tanzanians as well as at least 2 journalists and a candidate for August regional elections. The victims also included Somali-Canadian journalist and popular social media figure Hodan Nalaya, who focused on covering the beauty of her native country and its people. She moved back to Somalia just last year after 30 years away. She was pregnant and had 2 children. President Trump withdrew from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal to spite President Barack Obama. This according to newly leaked memo written by former British ambassador to the U.S. Kem Darroch in 2018. Ambassador Darroch called the move diplomatic vandalism motivated by ideological and personality reasons. Darroch stepped down from his position last week amidst fallout from earlier leaks in which he called Trump inept, insecure, and incompetent. In more news about Iran, Britain has said the oil tanker they seized off the coast of Gibraltar would be released if Iran guaranteed it was not heading to Syria, a violation of European sanctions. Meanwhile, President Hassan Rouhani has reiterated that he is ready to talk if harsh sanctions are lifted and the U.S. agrees to return to the landmark deal, which was deemed to be effective before the U.S. pulled out last year. Back in the U.S., the House voted along party lines to pass the $733 billion National Defense Authorization Act Friday. 27 Republicans joined with a majority of Democrats to pass an amendment to the act, restricting Trump's ability to launch a military strike on Iran without the approval of Congress. The Senate rejected such an amendment last month. The Senate and House defense bills must now be reconciled, making the fate of the bipartisan House amendment uncertain. Hurricane Barry was downgraded to tropical storm as it continues its path across Louisiana and neighboring states. Authorities warn the risk of dangerous storm surges and flash flooding remain high, but said the impact could have been much worse. Over 150,000 customers lost power in parts of Louisiana Sunday, while torrential downpours and flooding ruined homes and businesses in some areas. And celebrated union leader Hector Figueroa died Thursday at his home in Queens, New York, at the age of 57. Figueroa was the president of Local 32BJ of the Service Employees International Union, representing over 170,000 building cleaners, security guards, doormen and women, and airport workers. Figueroa was instrumental in key labor struggles across the city, including increasing airport workers' minimum wage to $19 an hour and the high-profile fight for a minimum wage of $15 an hour for fast food workers, which led to a nationwide campaign. This is Hector Figueroa speaking to Democracy Now! At May Day protests in 2017 here in New York City.
We all know that immigrant rights are worker rights. No more deportations, no more breaking families. We are here and we are going to stay. I'm going to fight because we work really hard. We feed the American public. We take care of their children. We clean the offices. We tend to the seniors. We are the ones who are making America strong, and we are here to stay.
That was Hector Figueroa, prominent New York City union leader, addressing May Day protests. He died last Thursday of a heart attack at the age of 57. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Widespread immigration raids did not materialize across the country this weekend after President Trump announced them in advance. A handful of raids, however, did still unfold and prompted protests in support of immigrant communities. Agents in Chicago reportedly arrested a mother and her kids, only to quickly release them. Arrests were also attempted here in New York City, but migrants reportedly refused to open their door to agents. Authorities say more raids are planned this week. Democracy Now! Was in Queens Sunday when residents protesting the raids were joined by local lawmakers, including Tiffany Caban, who recently declared victory in the highly contested Queens District Attorney's race that is now facing a recount.
Today, our community is getting together not only to protest the raids, the ICE raids, but also to call for the abolition of ICE. You know, acknowledging the fact that it is a rogue agency that puts a lot of our families, especially here in Queens, in danger of family separation and deportation. And really proud of the efforts, actually. You know, we know that there has been an ICE presence in the city, but we also know that so far, you know, we haven't had folks in Queens picked up. And I think that speaks to the strength of our communities, the ways that we're standing together, the ways that we're coming out and saying, we're going to let people know their rights. We're going to do what we can to protect our neighbors, and we're going to continue to do it for as long as we need to.
This comes amidst growing outrage over dire conditions for migrants held in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions by Customs and Border Patrol, including children and families seeking asylum. On Friday, Vice President Mike Pence toured 2 migrant detention centers in Texas, including one in McAllen, where hundreds of men were crowded into dirty cells without cots to sleep on. Many said they were hungry, had been detained for 40 days. Trump tweeted the children's rooms Pence saw were well-run and clean, and facilities for single men were clean but crowded. Pence defended conditions during an interview on CNN and refused to tell CNN's Pamela Brown.
Today was very different for the families versus the single adult migrants. It wasn't the same level of care.
What you saw today was a very clean facility where people were being detained indoors, and then you saw a temporary facility that was constructed because this facility is overcrowded. But everyone, even in that temporary facility, Pamela, is getting 3 meals a day. They're getting health care. They're getting hygiene.
Pence refused to say whether children would be separated from their parents during immigration raids announced by President Trump. Video of Pence visiting the Border Patrol facilities, looking at men in the overcrowded cells without speaking to them, then walking away, was broadcast around the world. At the same time, people held Lights for Liberties in at least 900 cities in what organizers called one of the largest global mass mobilizations in history. They called for the closure of detention centers and an end to inhumane treatment in them. This is activist Linda Sarsour speaking at the vigil in New York City's Foley Square, just across from an ICE processing center.
I want to remind people that there are children who have died in these camps, and I will say their names here today. Darlene Cristobal Cordova Valle, 10 years old from El Salvador. Jacqueline Carl Maquin, 7 years old from Guatemala. Felipe Gomez Alonso, 8 years old from Guatemala. Juan de Leon Gutierrez, 16 from Guatemala. Wilmer Jose Ramirez Vasquez, 2.5 years old from Guatemala. Carlos Hernandez Vasquez, 16 years old from Guatemala. One day, 30, 40 years from now, people are going to ask you, where were you when children were being stripped from the hands of their mothers? What did you do? What did you say? And you all get to say that I showed up and added my voice and chose not to be part of the silent majority in these United States of America that have allowed injustice to happen for far too long.
That was Linda Sarsour speaking at Friday's Lights for Liberty vigil in New York, was called to denounce the conditions in jails, child detention centers, adult detention facilities along the border, as well as what people believed, because President Trump tweeted it, that there would be widespread immigration raids across the country, which ultimately did not materialize, at least at this point. For more, we're joined by Laura Mukherjee, a professor of law and director of the Immigrant Rights Clinic at Columbia Law School. She spent about a week at the facility in Clint, Texas, interviewing dozens of detained children. She also represents Konstantin Mutu, the youngest child separated from his family at the border when he was just 4 months old. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Amy.
So I want to talk about both issues, the raids and also your trip to Clint, which is where we want to begin. Pence went there and talked about the conditions being humane and acceptable. You found something extremely different in the Clint facility. Describe what you saw.
We found children who were hungry, who were dirty, who were sick, and who were scared. We found children who had been detained far longer than the 72-hour limit for CBP facilities for children. We found children who had been detained a week, even longer, weeks, nearly a month. We found children wearing dirty clothing, clothing covered with nasal mucus, urine, vomit, breast milk. We found children who hadn't brushed their teeth for days, hadn't showered for days or weeks. We found children who smelled really bad because they had no opportunity to shower or change their clothes. We found children who were hungry. We found children who were so traumatized that they cried consistently and wept in their interviews with me. We found children who had been separated from a parent and from other family members. We found children who had been detained incommunicado without an opportunity to make a single phone call to their loved ones. So we took out our own phones and we allowed the children to make calls to their family members for the first time, sometimes in days, sometimes in weeks.
So these children actually could reach someone in the United States. Did some wear bracelets with numbers on them, at least one?
One child wore a bracelet that said U.S. parent on it. Other children...
With a phone number?
With either a phone number or some other kind of identifier. Other children had little scraps of paper tucked into a pocket in their shirt or in their pants that had the name of a family member. You know, what's so important for America to realize is that the overwhelming majority of these children have family members in the United States who are desperate to have their kids back. So nearly 100% of children who are released from ICE custody are released to a parent or other family member. More than 80% of children released from ORR custody, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, are reunited with a family member in the United States.
So explain the decision to come forward. These visits like you had, a group of lawyers to interview the children, are not usually made public. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. So I've been doing this work for 12 years along our southern border, representing detained immigrant children and families. I've been a monitor for the Flores Settlement Agreement numerous times. Last July, I was in Brownsville, Texas at Casa Padre, which is a controversial facility. In March, I was in Homestead interviewing children at an even more controversial facility. And in those two instances, I didn't go public with my findings, and I expressed concern about numerous violations of the Flores Settlement Agreement to the plaintiff's counsel in that case. But what we found in Clint was different. What we found in Clint was more appalling than anything I've seen in my entire professional career. I have never seen such degrading and inhumane treatment of children in federal immigration custody.
So what's going to happen? And did you testify before Congress?
I testified before the House Oversight Committee on Friday. We are demanding immediate congressional oversight to protect vulnerable children in custody. We are also seeking the assistance of the federal courts to protect the children in federal immigration custody and to make sure that their rights under federal law and under our Constitution are protected. We're also enlisting the support of the fourth branch of government, the free press, because we need assistance from everyone to make sure that children are not being abused in our name, with our taxpayer dollars, and in our country. The American people have risen up and across party lines have spoken out, have participated in a public outcry to let the executive branch know that children must not be abused in our country and in our name.
Talk about the independent organization or person who has been authorized to go in that the Trump administration has accepted to do oversight here.
So since the mid-1980s, there has been a case called the Flores case. In 1997, a settlement agreement was reached in that case. Part of the settlement agreement allows the Flores Plaintiffs' Counsel, so the lawyer for the children, to go into the facilities where children are being detained to monitor compliance with that Flores settlement agreement. The Flores settlement agreement sets forth that children must be detained in safe and sanitary conditions, and, more importantly, that children must be released from federal immigration custody as quickly as possible. So I've been a monitor for the Flores case.
During an interview on CNN this weekend, Pamela Brown pressed Vice President Pence in questions about family separation. She asked him if he was, quote, concerned families will be separated. And this has to do with the raids. She kept saying, will families be separated? Pence replied, people will be separated from this country who our courts have ordered to be deported. When pressed again if families would be separated, Pence said, quote, the priority is going to be on individuals who've committed crimes in this country, members of MS-13, people who've engaged in violent acts in this country in many cases. So let's go to the second point. These nationwide immigration raids that President Trump threatened the country with, they may not have materialized in force across the country, but certainly the terrorizing of immigrant communities did. But also, the flip side of that is the organizing.
Right. So the point of these raids is cruelty. These raids are not necessary. The data is very clear that when asylum-seeking families have access to counsel, they show up for their immigration proceedings 99% of the time. When asylum-seeking families participate in the ICE Case Family Management Program and are paired with a social worker, they show up for their immigration court proceedings 99% of the time. The point of the raids is cruelty. The point of the raids is terrorizing immigrant communities and playing to Trump's base.
And so, oddly, just him announcing this, it was amazing to see Pence say he wasn't going to say when they would happen because, that would undercut the effectiveness of the raids. And yet his own president, who he works for, his own president was the one who announced it around the country. Maybe his point was not actually to carry them out, but just to terrorize. Maybe it was because of, the census question that he didn't get, that he wanted, the question of citizenship, that he wanted some kind kind of retaliation for not being able to identify undocumented immigrants.
It is a heartbreaking situation, and the raids will leave children without their parents. The raids will leave children without their caregivers. The raids will leave U.S. citizen children without anyone in America to care for them. It is a heartbreaking situation.
Knowing your rights, forums were held, workshops, people calling in to find out what their rights are. Explain the issue of the warrant. While there weren't nationwide raids on the level that President Trump promised, there were reports here in New York of people not opening their doors to agents. Explain.
Right. So if you are someone who is undocumented and ICE is knocking at your door, here are your rights. You do not need to open the door. You should ask through the door whether the officers have a warrant. If they have a warrant, ask the officers to slip it under the door. Then check the warrant to make sure that it is signed by a judge. Very often, ICE shows up to carry out raids without a warrant or with a warrant that is not signed by a judge. Unless the warrant is signed by a judge, you do not need to open the door. You also have a right to remain silent when ICE is carrying out a raid. You do not need to provide your name. You do not need to state where you are from. You can state, if you want, that you wish to speak with an attorney. If ICE breaks down your door and comes into your house without your consent, you may also state, I do not consent to this search. And for anyone else who is witnessing a raid, I encourage everyone to be an upstander. Stand there. Bear witness, take videos, document what is happening. Try to protect those in our community who are asylum-seeking families, who are refugees, and who have the right to due process while they are in our country.
I want to end with by going to Brooklyn's Sunset Park. While the wholesale raids did not happen, the immigrant community was terrorized. Fabiola Mendieta is an organizer with the New Sanctuary Coalition. She told Democracy Now! About the effects of just the threat of the ICE raids.
Fifth Avenue, I have to say, if you come in a regular day, if you come on a Saturday, Sunday, if you go up to the park, up to 6th Avenue, you see a lot of people. You go to the laundromat, you see we're full of people because usually people is off on Saturday and Sundays. Today, we've been in the neighborhood since 6 o'clock in the morning. Some of my and other friends, they've been here since 5 o'clock in the morning. Everything was empty. No people in the streets, no people in the supermarkets, no people in the restaurant. I think everybody's just afraid to go out and, even to go to the supermarket. They don't want to do that anymore. At least, for this weekend and the days for this week.
Ilar Mukherjee, your final response, because the week isn't over. President Trump has threatened that the raids will materialize.
Yes, it's certainly possible that more raids will be carried out, that more families will be targeted. But immigrants' rights lawyers will fight back. We will represent these families. We will ensure that they have a chance to present their asylum cases to the courts. And it's telling that one of the families that was arrested in Chicago was immediately released, a mother and her children. These are not people who pose a danger to our communities.
Ilar Mukherjee, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Professor of Law and Director of the Immigrants' Rights Clinic at Columbia Law School. Spent about a week at the facility in Clint interviewing dozens of detained children. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Mancos, Colorado. Denver was one of the places they threatened these raids. Well, hours away is a woman who's taken sanctuary in a church. Stay with us.
There's a place where I've been told every street is paved with gold, and it's just across the borderline. And when it's time to take your turn, here's a lesson that you must learn. more than you'll ever hope to find. When you reach the broken promised land, every dream slips through your hand.
Across the Borderline by Gabby Moreno and Van Dyke Parks. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Reports. I'm Amy Goodman. As immigrant communities brace for ongoing raids this week, sanctuary cities are also under attack. On Friday, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the Trump administration's push to withhold federal funding for local policing in sanctuary cities that refuse to comply with certain immigration policies, like giving agents access to jail records of immigrants in custody. We're going now to Mancos, Colorado, where we're joined by a woman who's been in sanctuary in the United Methodist Church since 2017. Rosa Sabido is one of dozens of undocumented immigrants living in churches across the country to avoid deportation. She says she first came to the United States on a visitor visa more than 30 years ago in 1987 to see her mother and stepfather, who are both naturalized citizens. She says she traveled back and forth between Colorado and Mexico for a decade until she was questioned by immigration officials about her visa and told her to leave the United States. Instead, she stayed and continued going to regular check-ins, requesting multiple stays of deportation, and was granted them until May of 2017, when she was told her latest request had been denied. That's when she entered sanctuary. For more on how she's been impacted by the latest crackdown on immigrants, including the threats of nationwide raids, Rosa Sabido joins us now via Democracy Now! Video stream, because she can't go to a studio. She's in sanctuary in a church in Mancos in southwest Colorado in the Four Corners. Rosa, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you talk about why you're in the church right now, and though you're inside, what you feel as you hear about these threats of ICE agents moving in to take undocumented immigrants away and deport them?
Good morning, Amy. Thank you. Even us who live in sanctuary, we're not away from the danger of maybe being detained or maybe ICE breaking their moral agreement that they have with the sacred places or sensitive places like the churches. So yes, we are in fear. We are and on guard, like we are on constant panic and we don't know what is going to happen. We don't know what is going to happen in our communities. We don't know what is going to happen with us, and we just remain with our uncertainty, and we know we are protected by the communities and the churches, but we never know what is going to happen.
Were you afraid this weekend? What stops ICE from entering the churches? I mean, you have Jeanette Vizguera, who has taken refuge once again in the Unitarian Church in Denver. You have women throughout Colorado in churches. Were you afraid, Rosa, this weekend?
Yes, we are afraid every day, not only this weekend. I mean, that raised our fear because, we are people with high profiles because we are going public and we are resisting the system. And we are, even though we are in peaceful resistance, we still are, we are seen as fugitives, the eyes of ICE and the government. So yes, we are always in constant fear. Every time we hear someone knocking at the door, it's just to get into a moment of panic because we don't know who may that be, and if we don't know who's entering into the
church, we don't know who that person might be. So yes, we are. And then we are even more now because, nothing is secure anymore.
While you were in sanctuary, your beloved mother, Blanca, died of cancer. Our condolences on your loss. Can you talk about what that meant for you, being separated from her?
Well, she was my first priority to remain in the country because of her poor health conditions. Therefore, for me being in sanctuary, I was not able to be with her, take care of her, go with her to the doctor's appointment, be her interpreter as I always did, filling out paperwork, taking care of her, the basics. So on a trip she did to Mexico, she decided to get treatment there, and because I was not able to be with her. And unfortunately, she passed away on July 23rd of last year. And for me, I'm paying like a very hard price for the sacrifice and this fight that I'm this battle that I'm fighting in sanctuary. She was like my motivation. She was the reason why I wanted to remain, or one of the reasons, but the biggest reason. And now I wasn't able to be with her. I wasn't able to say goodbye. I haven't been able to even mourn her death, and it's just like so.
Rosa, why did you decide to enter the church in 2017? I mean, you lived in this country for more than 3 decades. You were doing regular check-ins. The last one under President Trump was denied. Is that right? Why did you choose this mode of resistance?
Well, there was no other choice. I mean, it was just turn myself to ICE and just be at their mercy and maybe just be deported in a couple of days, and or this option to be in sanctuary. And it was not, I never knew how long I was going to be in sanctuary. And I think the strongest reason is, as you mentioned, I have lived here 32 years now, 32 years of my life. That's over half of my life. And I've been a good citizen. I have been contribute to the community. I've been working. I have never taken advantage of anything from the government. I don't have any criminal records. I've been trying to become a permanent resident all those years. And so I think those are enough reasons to remain and resist and keep fighting until the end.
Well, Rosa Sabido, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Rosa is undocumented from Mexico. She has lived in this country for more than 30 years, regularly going to her check-ins. She took sanctuary at the Fellowship Hall at the United Methodist Church of Mancos, Colorado. And special thanks to Laurel Smith, who took the photos and video that we've been showing for our TV audience around the world of Rosa in sanctuary. And also a special thanks to my niece, Ariel Goodman, who presented Sanctuary Stories, which is a collaboration with Rosa Sabido and other women who have taken sanctuary, a multimedia storytelling collaboration with the women on the front lines of Colorado's struggle for immigrant rights. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the climate catastrophe in Asia, Nepal, India, and on the shores of Louisiana. Stay with us.
Whoa, mercy, mercy me. All things and what they used to be. No, oil, wasted on the oceans and upon our seas, fish full of mercury. Oh, mercy, mercy me. All things ain't what they used to be. Radiation underground and in the sky. Animals and birds who live nearby are dying. Oh, mercy, mercy me. All things ain't what they used to be. What about this overcrowded land? How much more will you from me? Can't you stand?
Mercy, Mercy Me, The Ecology by Marvin Gaye. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As Tropical Storm Barry made landfall in Louisiana, with millions of people under flash flood alert. An even more dire climate catastrophe was playing out across South Asia, where ongoing heavy rain and flooding have killed around 100 people, 67 in Nepal, 25 in India, 14 in Bangladesh. Monsoon rains displacing 1 million people, including thousands of Rohingya Muslim refugees in southern Bangladesh's Cox's Bazar, the largest refugee camp in the world. The flooding has also destroyed crops across the region. This is Mohammed Feroz Khan, an Indian farmer in Uttar Pradesh.
The rainfall has also been extreme, 70 to 72 hours of continuous rain. The water level kept increasing and slowly submerged farmlands. Nearly all of the crops have been destroyed.
Monsoon season regularly pummels South Asia with deadly rains. Flooding killed more than 1,000 people in 2017, but this year's flooding has been even worse, is likely fueled by global warming, which has led to more extreme weather in the region. Scientists warn the risk of deadly floods is not over. Here in the United States, New Orleans residents managed to avoid the worst of Tropical Storm Barry, but 11 million remain on flash flood warning after the storm slowly made its way through Louisiana, making its way to Arkansas. President Trump declared a state of emergency in Louisiana, where more than 60,000 people remained without power on Sunday. It was well over 100,000. And, of course, here in New York, you had this power outage of just a few hours. A city that is so heavily based on fossil fuel in the grid, though it is slowly changing under the city and state's Green New Deal, encouraging buildings, even the skyscrapers, to have solar panels on their roofs. For more, we go to Seattle to speak with Dar Jamal, the independent journalist and author of The End of Ice, Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption. His most recent piece for Truth Out headlined "Over 1/10 of the global population could lack drinking water by 2030. Dar, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about what you think is most important to understand now as we talk about the climate catastrophe that is enveloping us around the world.
Well, everything we just heard about what you're reporting with these ice raids and the migrant crisis, the vast majority of these people are climate refugees. So to anyone in this country that thinks this crisis is not just on our doorstep, but we're living with the ramifications of it, that's just one layer of it. We can look around the world and just see right now before our very eyes evidence of how deep in this crisis we already are. It's not a future tense thing anymore. We are in it, and it is going to grow worse. But even right now, we saw regionally high temperature records across the Arctic for May. June was a record hot June for Alaska. July 4th, Anchorage saw 90 degrees. We're seeing feedback loops up there already kicked in, things like the tundra and the permafrost. The tundra specifically already becoming a net producer of carbon rather than a carbon sink. If we look down to the Antarctic, sea ice there is melting at record rates. 2014, according to a recent study, was a record high year of sea ice extent in Antarctica, the ice continent. In 3 years, by 2017, sea ice had reduced to its lowest level ever recorded, losing in that short 3-year period area of ice larger than the size of the country of Mexico. You were talking about the flooding in Asia. In addition to all the deaths you mentioned, in June in Mumbai, in one 48-hour period, they received their average monthly rainfall in just one 48-hour period. These things are happening right in front of us, and I think that's a very important part of this discussion that people need to understand and take in.
I want to turn to an interview last month Vice President Pence did, repeatedly refusing to say the climate crisis is a threat to the United States. He was interviewed by CNN's Jake Tapper.
Do you think human-induced climate emergency is a threat to the United States?
Well, what I will tell you is that we'll always follow the science on that in this administration.
The science says it is.
But what we won't do, and the Clean Power Plan was all about that, was hamstringing energy in this country, raising the cost of utility rates for working families across this country.
But is it a threat?
While other nations like China and India do absolutely nothing or make illusory promises decades down the road to deal with it. You know, the truth of the matter is, with the advent of natural gas, with the natural gas explosion that's developing, with clean coal technology, we're seeing a significant reduction in carbon emissions all across this country.
But is what people are calling a climate emergency, is it a threat? Do you think it's a threat? Man-made climate emergency is a threat?
I think the answer to that is going to be based upon the science.
Well, the science says yes. I'm asking you what you think.
There's many in the science that...
The science community in your own administration, at NOAA, at the DNI, they all say it's a threat.
Look, what the president has said, what we've said is that we are not going to raise utility rates.
So you don't think it's a threat, is all I'm saying. You don't think it's a threat.
I think we're making great progress reducing carbon emissions. America has the cleanest air and water in the world. We'll continue to use market forces.
We don't have the cleanest air and water in the world. We don't. You get back to me with some statistics to show
we're making progress on reducing carbon emissions.
There is the Vice President of the United States refusing to say climate change, that the climate crisis is a threat. Your response, Dar Jamal, as he says you have to look at the science.
Well, it's certainly not a surprise that these fossil fuel stooges of this administration would react exactly as Pence just did. I mean, they have their talking points, they have their marching orders, and they're just simply executing them. Meanwhile, if we look around the world at what's happening, again, the evidence is right in front of our face. There's so many Native American stories that have talked about what happens when we do not live in harmony with Mother Nature and what happens if we get out of balance with that. One of them that I've written about and discussed is a story from the Pitt River Nation told by Darrell Wilson of the Pitt River Nation of northeastern California. And just as an example, he talks about a spirit force called Mis Misa that lives inside of Akuyet, the mountain that white people name Mount Shasta. And as long as humans listen very carefully and comport themselves correctly towards that mountain and listen to that spirit voice, nature will be kept in balance. But if people stop listening altogether, and if enough people stop listening, then that spirit force, Mis Misa, will go away and stop singing, and everything on the planet will go out of balance, and life therein vulnerable to extinction. And that's just one of countless stories and prophecies that warned of exactly what is upon us. We industrialized humans have stopped listening to the planet. We've stopped living in harmony, and now we're living in the time of reckoning of that. And unfortunately, if we look at all of the science, this is just the beginning. Everything that we're seeing, everything that everybody knows about the climate crisis to date has happened from just raising the temperatures 1.1 C above pre-industrial baseline levels. We are looking at temperature escalations in the coming years, not even talking about 2100, but even by 2050, that we could see several times that amount of increase, according to some of the most dire scientific predictions. And so Sorry, go ahead, Amy.
I wanted to say a senior State Department intelligence analyst has recently resigned in protest after the Trump administration blocked parts of his written testimony to Congress about the dangers of climate change. In June, analyst Rod Schoonover was permitted to appear before the House Intelligence Committee to testify about the national security risk posed by global warming, but the White House barred him from submitting peer-reviewed scientific journal articles and intelligence reports as evidence to back his claims. Part of his censored testimony to Congress read, quote, absent extensive mitigating factors or events, we see few plausible future scenarios where significant, possibly catastrophic harm does not arise from the compounded effects of climate change. Catastrophic harm. But he wasn't allowed to say this to Congress. And I want to talk about some of those just catastrophic harms. One of those, which you most recently wrote about for Truth Out, over 1/10 of global population could lack drinking water by 2030. Tell us what you found.
Right. That's according to studies and warnings coming out of the country of India, where literally half the population of the entire country is on track if things do not change. And clearly things are changing, but unfortunately for the worse. But on the current trajectory, by 2030, we're talking barely over 10 years from right now, half the country of India is likely going to be facing not having enough drinking water. That, the bigger translation of that's 1/10 the global population. That's on top of people already today that lack enough drinking water, on top of the fact that the UN is warning of tens of millions more climate refugees just in the next decade alone. We talk about these catastrophic effects. One of these is children in cages. It's what the whole first half of the show was just on. I mean, these changes are right in front of our face. And so when the Trump administration talks about, we're going to use our scientists and we're going to rely on science, this is a fossil fuel lobby talking point that they're following. If we look at all of the other science around the world, and even save the science, if we just use our own eyes and look at these events unfolding right in front of us, it's very, very clear. Now, Amy, when I published my recent book, this is the result of 9 years of intensive climate reporting and a meticulous research. And I went into the field and I went to the front lines with leading scientists and saw with my own eyes what is happening. And everything that I found is right there. And I didn't even know how right that I had it. And what we're seeing playing out in front of us, though, now is so accelerated and so much faster than I thought, even when the book came out, that I am shaking my head on a daily basis as I write these ongoing climate dispatches. And so it is a situation where this is likely my last journalism book, because on this crisis, the evidence is in front of us. We keep reporting the same stories over and over. We just keep adjusting the numbers upwards. And like we always used to hear when we were reporting from Iraq about how bad things were becoming there, today is better than tomorrow, and that certainly applies to the climate crisis. June was the hottest June ever recorded on the planet. The last 5 years are the hottest 5 years in history. This is the trajectory that we're on, and these numbers are only going to continue to increase.
And then talk about who it affects. A UN expert has warned we're on track for climate apartheid, where wealthy people can pay their way out of the consequences of climate devastation, while others will face hunger, conflict, mass displacement. The new report is by Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, concluding the UN and the larger human rights community has been complacent in the planet's impending disaster, and that even if current global emissions targets are met, millions will be impoverished. Poorer nations expecting to bear at least 75% of the costs of climate change, even as the poorer half of the world's population generates just 10% of global emissions. Dar.
Right. I believe the numbers from that report are 120 million more people driven into poverty by climate impacts by just 2030. And that's on top of the people that are already there. Again, the evidence, you just spent 30 minutes reporting on the evidence and talking to these poor people who are fleeing their countries because they do not have food. They cannot grow crops. The support in their own countries to help them through this crisis, to help them find another way of living, even just basic necessities like food, shelter, and health care, is not there. These people are risking their lives to go to a completely different country to try to find help. And think about it. Here in the U.S., so many of us live in this bubble where we, at least for now, have enough food and water and something like health care if we're lucky. How bad would things have to get for each one of us to leave everything that we know and love, places where we've spent large parts of our lives, and go to a completely new foreign country, especially one that we know hates us and rejects us, and the government is demonizing us and going to great lengths to keep us out. And if we manage to get in, is going to terrorize us and kick us out. That's how bad it is for people living in poverty already.
Well, Dar Jamel, we want to thank you for being with us. We're going to go with you to part 2, and we'll post online at democracynow.org. Dar Jamel's new book, The End of ICE, Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption. We'll link to your piece. Over 1/10 of the global population could face drinking water lack by 2030.